Our speaker tonight is Jeannie Iseman, the Executive Director of the GardenWorks Project, which the GardenWorks Project promotes organic suburban agriculture to improve the well-being of our community, the environment, and those facing food insecurity. And Jeannie and her husband both share a passion for gardening and community building and have spent many years using their backyard as an informal community garden for friends and neighbors. Upon hearing about the GardenWorks project, Jeannie was fascinated by their vision and mission and joined the board in late 2016. Jeannie has a master's degree in public policy and a background in social services, but most days you will find Jeannie chasing her 3 small children around or serving as a worship leader at her church. She is also an RYT 200 yoga instructor since 2011 and especially loves practicing yoga outdoors. And now I'll turn it over to Jeannie.
Thank you so much for the introduction, everyone. And let's see if I could get this started. So can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So again, I'm with the GardenWorks Project, and we are based out of the city of West Chicago. But we have been working within the Western Chicagoland region for, it will be our 10th year of Garden Builds. So we started in 2012 by our founder who essentially wanted to have a volunteer project for her family and heard about an organization like ours and decided to start it out of Glen Ellen, and it just grew from there. That first year, she built 4 garden beds, and last year we built 110 home gardens. We build raised gardens for the purposes of providing individuals and households that are facing food insecurity, reliant on food pantries, maybe seeking some sort of emergency food assistance. And we provide these raised bed gardens in their home so that they can learn to grow for themselves. And it's just a great empowerment tool that hopefully will be a habit that lasts a lifetime. And I'm glad I'm in good company. I know all of you are gardeners. So you know the benefits that can come from it, not only of just being outdoors, having seeing the beauty of the produce or the product that comes out of some hard work, and just the value of eating locally and eating right from your own garden. Our vision is just that everyone deserves fresh produce, and in a time of COVID, in a time of just a lot of economic instability, it's been really enlightening and eye-opening to see individuals who have never been to food pantries ever before in their lives seeking our services and are going to food pantries for the first time. So regardless of their situation, we want to be able to provide fresh produce to anyone who needs it. So our vision is just to see a community nourished and empowered to grow and share food. And we use a neighbor-to-neighbor approach. We essentially will equip a group of individuals to go to someone's home, and this is obviously outside of COVID, but we do have people who have actually attended our builds that are here today. So our home gardening program, we have installed 525 home gardens within Western Chicagoland, and we've served over 2,000 clients since we've started. And we've also built 19 community gardens within the region since 2017. And these community gardens are really specific in that they are for the purposes of donating back to food pantries or places that really need fresh produce. So if there's a school that could potentially utilize it for their students, their families that attend, I think of Tioga Schools in Bensonville that just received a garden last year, and they were able to produce for their families that are all within their Head Start program. And so these people are fairly income dependent and are utilizing their local food pantry and have found a lot of joy during the summer to be able to go there every day, not only drop off and pick up their children, but also be able to tend their gardens. We use spaces like that often for individuals who don't have access to their own land. And so it is a luxury, even in DuPage County, with so much green space, to be able to have space to garden for yourself. And there are a lot of individuals that are lacking that space. So we try to provide that as well. And finally, we have a Food Growers Network for $25. It's a membership-based network that promotes food security and sustainability through educational events. And we last year started a Food Readers Book Club that meets quarterly. Just a couple weeks ago, we actually had our first event of the year, and we read Good Food Revolution by Will Allen in celebration of Black History Month. And we also watched the virtual keynote from Soulfire Farm, which is a farm out of upstate New York that is trying to use and reclaim farmland and green space to be able to promote racial equity. So a lot of hot topics right now, but you guys are all here to talk about square foot gardening. So I don't know if any of you have done raised bed gardening, but what we're going to talk about today is essentially being able to try to maximize the amount of space that you have within your own yard and maximize your harvest in all the while. So we always try to promote the fact that if you have extra space, create an extra garden this year and donate it to a local food pantry. Dedicate it as a donation garden. You know, the amount of benefit that you get and the amount of doubling your produce, you know, it really is like an efficiency scale. You don't see double the work often. And with square foot gardening, it is in some ways labor intensive, but compared to in-ground gardening, which I had done all of my life until I started square foot gardening just about 10 years ago, it really is a lot more efficient use of space and just a lot better to maintain. Let's see here. How come it's not progressing? Okay, so with traditional farming, you know, you obviously see sort of the linear singular crop with rotation. That's really the ag standard right now. There's a ton of literature right now that's coming forward. Even the state of Iowa is making some great strides in terms of providing some more innovative ways to be able to maintain soil and soil health for long-term sustainability. There's a lot of new research done on what needs to change in order for agriculture within the United States to remain sustainable. And this is really not a sustainable option. There are ways to do that linear model in your own home garden, but I think in order to maintain soil health, which we'll talk about later, there is a real need for just very meticulous rotation and a little bit of rest as well. But what you see with modern gardens, you always see, you're seeing a little more of that diversity. It's not just square or a grid form. You also see that non-linear, and you also see a lot of regenerative type models as well. Within these modern gardens, you also see raised beds for season extension. So they are purposeful, not only just for the aesthetic. You also see the diversity component for succession planting. And then we also see some natural pest controls and organic practices that are starting to enter in a bit more. And I know that we are always in a constant battle, and maybe marigolds have worked for you, maybe they haven't, but we always try to at least give a couple tips and techniques to our home gardeners as well. So all of this information is information that we really try to instill by year 3 for our gardeners. But I will say that, you know, a lot of it is something just that comes with time, you know, and I'm sure you all can resonate with that, you know, there are some years that just work really well and other years that don't. So within the modern garden, we're starting to talk a lot more about using nutrient-rich soil, using organic amendments rather than just straight up fertilizers. There are organic fertilizers, but how can you do that in a way that is sustainable and potentially easier on the budget? There are a lot of ways to be able to use things straight from your kitchen over into your garden. Native gardens to augment pollination has been something that I know you all have talked through. I know that when we attended the Green Fest, there was the Monarch Project that was going on, and these are all, they all go in tandem. And then also modern gardens, you're starting to see urban spaces that are utilizing even the vertical approach to be able to really maximize limited space. And it does, in some ways, create some benefit in terms of weed reduction and soil fixation. I had mentioned the Bensonville Garden. This is actually one of them. This is one of our models for a raised bed garden. If you look closely, you'll see that, for example, the chive plant, this was all new, but the chive plant, which was the only perennial that continued to grow, this was its second year, is all in the same place. And so for our home gardeners, we actually, for their first year, will always keep the same model so that if they were to follow us through the growing season, they can see what it looks like. But square foot gardening really is a little bit of that linear grid approach, but it is utilizing a small space, which these gardens are 4x8s. And we're using really soft, easy soil to work with, a lot of that compost amendment to be able to help it out and give it a real boost. And the fact that we're constantly adding the raised bed garden soil as well as the compost, no tilling really is required. We're just topping off and adding to it. It's sort of similar to the no-till approach that I know has gotten really popular as well. Just trying to kill off any of the grass that's underneath and then topping off with compost and letting just essentially the earth do its work, including the worms and all the microbiomes, or to be able to create a good environment for our plants. The other advantage that we do see with a lot of our gardens is that there is an element of heat that does come around the garden beds earlier on. And so you can start the season a little earlier than other in-ground plants. And then you can also end later because you can also either add in a hoop or cover, even just having a blanket over some of your plants, just given that you have that frame, but you will also have that higher temperature in soil. One of the disadvantages of that is higher temperatures will often mean that gardens will tend to dry out. So there is a little more of that management, which is why usually raised bed gardening is quite intensive in terms of how much you put in. Per square inch, per square foot, you're putting in a lot more to try to fit in and maximize that space. One of the other, obvious disadvantages is that initial expense. It is a little higher than in-ground gardening. If you were to trust your soil and hope for the best, and you just, dug up a space, that is your medium if you're using in-ground. But the initial expense of putting in a raised bed, we actually use cedar raised material, raised bed wood for our gardens. And I think even a pressure treated pine is perfectly fine. And the raised bed garden mix is also another thing that we add in. We use Kellogg's, which is available at Home Depot. And for a 4x8 bed, you need about 20 cubic feet of soil. So it's a lot of bags of soil. And so it ends up being a pretty large initial expense. If you have a compost bin from then on, you really won't need to add any more. You just add from that compost pile. And, if you decide to buy a kit There are many raised bed systems that are now a bit more expensive, some that use self-watering, some that come with irrigation, some that even have a self-composting mechanism in the middle, which is now getting pretty attractive, where you put your kitchen scraps in the middle. I actually can't speak on any of that because I don't know if it works, but I do know some people who are trying it this spring. In COVID, it's a good time to try anything, right? And then I think the one other disadvantage that we've noticed, and it continues to be a challenge, is trying to secure vertical elements into your raised bed, because your soil is so soft. You really need to drive all of your tomato cages and all your posts down fairly far in order for them to stay secured. With in-ground gardening, you have just more of that natural, like clay-based soil often, and so you do get to that clay level much more quickly, and so we do see that as a little bit of a disadvantage for our families. So raised bed gardening, I think one of the main key components is to plan it all out. So we always encourage people to have a notebook or a journal, a sketch pad. Right now is the time to be looking through, I'm sure you all are looking through seed catalogs alongside, I spend most of my evenings doing that. But right now it's the time to make that wish list of all the things that you grow consistently every year, all the things that you like to grow, and we start to separate them out by spring and summer and fall. And then you want to consider different varieties, plant dates, expected harvests. We are in 5B, and in the summer you can obviously grow things that would be strictly annuals, but these are all types of product that you want to, or excuse me, hang on one second. I'm hearing some kind of noise. Are you all hearing that? Oh, okay. No. Okay, it seemed to go away, so I think it was like a little bit of a buzzing. Okay. So, you want to map out each month, which we'll talk about shortly, what needs to be planted, what needs to be replanted, what is going to stay throughout the season. And those will all come up out of your wish list and what you plan out. And the last thing is really just to date everything, not only just to reflect back at the end of the season, but also just the fact that timing even through that given season is really key for a food gardener. So other materials needed, trellises, some thrifty options is using headboards, ladders. I'm sure there are a lot of creative elements that you may even have within your own gardens. And then unique ways to separate items, especially if you're going to be using perennial plants or trying to utilize some cover crops throughout the season. Other, thrifty options would be making compost tea, learning how to do that, finding some organic fertilizers or using some amendments. There are always those tricks of the trade of baking soda or, Epsom salt. So just having those things at the ready. Other options that people have used, as long as it's untreated wood, there are the pallet gardens and the pallet compost bins that I've seen as actually really successful. One gardener of ours grows a plethora of tomato cages or tomatoes every year, and he uses concrete rebar for his tomato cages and has been able to use them for many, many years, just given that they're galvanized steel, and they are a little bit of an investment, but that being said, they really do last a long time, and they are very sturdy for raised bed gardens, just given that you are using more of a cylindrical shape rather than the conical shape, which would normally happen. For some of our gardens, when we have the amount of space, we actually turn some of our cheaper, smaller tomato cages upside down so that they're actually sitting like a cone rather than the upside down triangle, and that does seem to help as well. So just being creative just to be able to get through the garden season. I don't know if any of you have any recommendations. We can talk through catalogs later, but some of the ones that we, obviously recommend are right here. Anybody that's into Asian crops, the Kitazawa Seed Company is one that is a lot of fun, and it is specifically Asian produce. And that's been around for about 100 years. And Seed Savers Exchange and Baker Creek and Territorial are always fun ones. High mowing seed we actually use for our cover crops for our families, and I've purchased from them many years for my cover crops, and they seem to work really well. So you may have a favorite as well. And this may be things that you already know, but not recommended for transplanting. So, right now is the time to start starting your seeds. And I think DuPage Garden Club did a topic on winter sowing. I love it. I think it's such a great way. As a lazy gardener, I just want to plant the seeds and forget it. And I get disappointed almost every year when I don't water, and my little leggy plants, they die off after so much painstaking work. So winter sowing is a great way to go. If those are going to be for plants that you're really going to have to transplant. So anything that you're not going to transplant and you're just going to put straight in, I usually put in a separate section that's going to be more of a subsection for that spring, summer, and fall. And those are going to be the corns and grasses, the legumes, the worm vining, and then also our root crops. So the square foot gardening model is based on an approach. It's a book that was written by someone named Mel Bartholomew, and it uses a combination of gardening techniques. And the GardenWorks uses a lot of his techniques, but we also have incorporated some of our own. And so we'll talk a bit about some of his techniques, as well as things that we do as well and encourage. So this is just a picture of one of our beautiful gardens. And this was probably in September when we took a picture of it. So just to give you an idea of that intensive planting model, those Brussels sprouts and the kales were planted in the summer, and they are refreshed later on in the fall, but the idea is that they are all varieties that should be able to grow till the first frost. So plants are grown really close together here, and in some ways they are helping support each other as they grow, not only nutrient-wise and soil fixation-wise, but also based on just their vertical elements. So we really try to pair them pretty conscientiously on how large they're going to be, how much space they're going to need by peak of harvest. This is a garden where it was a family or a group that ended up having just too much kale, and they had requested a lot of it and did not really enjoy it. So I would never recommend to have this much kale and just to let it grow, because it is taking up about half the garden. But everybody gets tired of kale by the summer. But plants in the intensive planting model, they're grown really close together, and each square represents one variety. And so you get you don't get the linear lines, but you do get the grid. That one by one square is going to represent one variety. And you will end up having, within a 4x8, 32 squares. And the way that it is planted is, depending on the variety, you will have a particular number of seeds or plants within each square. So for example, broccolis and cabbage, you're going to have just one, because at peak they're going to be fairly large. Some of the large vining plants, you're going to have zucchini and cucumber. You're also going to have one, although you could add, if it's going to be a vining cucumber that can really work through a vertical element. You put it on the edge and you let it grow up. Small brassicas like bok choy, you can put 4. And then we start getting even more intense. Beets, you can put 9 in 1 square foot. And it sounds almost ridiculous. A bush bean plant, can you really put 9? But we do every year. And what's amazing about it is that they are just working together and they are prolific. I've actually had the best bean harvest that I've ever had by placing 9 in 1 square foot. Carrots and radishes, onions and lettuce, you can put 16 per plant in it. I mean, 16 per square foot. So you're essentially using a 3x3. It sounds intense, but it does work. So within the square foot gardening, you know, like we said before, lots of advantages, also some disadvantages here. This one is actually a picture from a stock photo, and now that I see it, it looks a little sad. But you can see just the description of how they're using it in sort of a grid model. They have everything labeled. And now that I'm looking at it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend all of these combinations. Just the way that they're going to end up trellising that cucumber right in the middle is going to be problematic. But this is all just part of that, the joy of just giving it a try. Soil composition is actually really important. You want that soft soil. I love the fact that with my raised bed gardens, I can literally stick my fist down into the soil and hit the bottom of my raised bed garden. Mel Bartholomew's mix is actually a little complicated. It's a combination of vermiculite, peat moss, and blended compost. And in order for our volunteers to be able to achieve that combination and to be able to have something that's not going to be so difficult to create, we actually use a combination of organic compost, mushroom compost in the spring, and then composted cow manure in the fall, as well as Kellogg's raised bed garden mix. And the combinations are here. So Mel's mix is 1/3 of each. And then there is some other options that people have used. You can obviously go on websites of your choice that you trust, and I'm sure that they will have that. There's a ton of YouTubes about, you know, what to do beyond using Mel's mix or trying to find a more thrifty option. But I especially like the raised bed garden mix from Kellogg's because it does have the pine fines and it also has the peat moss. So it does create that aeration automatically. And it also has the kelp, the guano, and the earthworm castings. So just that good, yeah, excess. So within the intensive planning model, you know, while you could have an entire 4x8 that is utilized with corn or zucchini, we always recommend that you companion plant. Back to that idea of that traditional agriculture, that we're trying to do away with that by planting different crops together for reasons including pest control, pollination. You're providing a more natural habitat for beneficial creatures, and you maximize that use of space. You also increase crop productivity by allowing there to be a little bit of diversity. And we go back to the indigenous roots of the Native Americans, you know, using a lot of that traditional American grouping, such as the Three Sisters, of having the corn that's planted in a hill form and having the squash next to it. That's going to be that natural protection, that water, moisture retention, but also that barrier for pests. And then you're going to have the beans all around it. That's going to be that nitrogen fixer, and it's going to climb up on the corn, increasing the stability of the corn in the end. And then, you know, there are also a lot of different other companion plants that really not only improve the flavor. I've never tried chives with strawberries, but I've heard about this, and that the chives actually improve the flavor and the sweetness of the strawberries. Whereas basils and tomatoes, I mean, you eat them, together, and apparently they increase crop yields. And I did basils underneath my row of tomatoes this year, and what was really wonderful about it is that and I spoke to somebody who is a soil scientist about this, that basil is not much of a nutrient suck. And so they are pretty soil neutral. And so it does create a little bit of a blanket for the tomatoes, and it increases tomato yields in the end. Tomatoes do take a ton away from soil, and they are not as disease resistant depending on the variety. And so it's really important to be able to diversify when you're planting with tomatoes, and also to move them around year to year. Other, reasons to companion plant: it regenerates tough soil. So green beans are always my go-to fixer, and using especially the bush beans because they really do saturate. Another tip that I learned from my soil scientist friend, instead of pulling out the plants, you cut at the base of the stem at the end of the year and allow the roots, which are full of those little nitrogen nodules. If you pull them up, you'll see these almost like, tubers, like a potato, at the base of the roots, and you leave those there and let them essentially just decompose, and your soil will be much more amended and ready to go by spring. Other amendments include cover crops. So this year we're going to be adding in cover crops for our families starting April 1st. And then by May 15th, given that it's a raised bed garden, all we need to do is just pull them up and just turn them into the soil, let them decompose, and we're going to plant right on top of them. I had already mentioned with tomatoes, and a couple other tips with trying to keep nightshades spread from each other, and allowing them to rotate as well. We also use nasturtiums, and we use marigolds, and we try to encourage our families to plant flowers if they want within their raised bed garden. So giving them packets of seeds and telling them wait until about July, and then add in a couple of these really quick annuals, and you'll have a beautiful garden through the fall. And then succession planning, which is really key to that journal that I had mentioned before. So we want to plant seasonally, and we want to look at that harvest date. We want to look at what is really going to diversify our soil. Those that are that may know about permaculture, it's essentially that concept of being able to create essentially a little biosphere, of space, so that there is that diversification and that enriching and that feeding off of each other. So research seed varieties to find, what germinates well and when. Frost hardy varieties, for example, they can start in early spring, or they can start in the fall. And we actually use a lot of our frost hardy varieties, such as like the kales and the bok choys, and we may even start some of those from seed if we're starting them in the spring. But in the fall, when we plant them, which is usually around mid-August, we plant them as seedlings, because the soil is actually just too hot at that point that they're not going to germinate well. So what to plant and when. So just keeping in mind that we're that 5B, and there's always that that good luck charm by planting peas on March 17th on St. Patrick's Day. We may still have snow on the ground, we may not, but usually we try to encourage people who are on their second year of gardening to plant in early April, and then we'll come in and plant for them at the end of May or the 1st of June, and then we plant again on August 15th. So those would be those key sets. And there are limited numbers of things that you can do in April, much more in the summer and much more in the fall. And we do, at least for our families, fill in August 15th, knowing that your tomatoes are still producing, maybe haven't even started to harvest yet. your peppers are just coming to fruition at that point. And so we're not pulling those plants out, but anything that were, lettuces or any of the root vegetables, we're trying to pull out and make space. We do a refresh of green beans as well, but we usually try to relocate them to a different spot, and we put something a little more intensive in that spot in August. Yeah, and then, our last frost date is May 1st. Our first frost date is October 9th. You can never trust that May 1st date, and so we usually wait until at least May 15th to start planting any of our warm season plants. So here's an example of what we would do on April 1st. We do some radishes, beets, and carrots, lettuce. And then our second planting would be in mid-May, and we would pull a lot of those out. Obviously, the radishes would be ready at that point. Carrots and beets, probably not, but then lettuce would be as well, possibly, especially if you did a broadcast of a mixed mezclin lettuce. And then we would bring in the warm seasons and add those in. And then at that point in August, your cucumbers may be done, your beets and carrots will for sure be done, and your beans may be done. We're going to put in some kales, cabbage, parsley, lettuce, broccoli rabe. And then if you wanted to do a winter crop and just do a special planting, and then when you pull everything out, you clean out your garden. I actually did mine in November, and they were fine this year just because it was such a warm season. And then you can use that garden space, and you would have to harvest in July. So that would be a off season for that garden bed. So I would only recommend that if you had an extra garden bed. So, and another concept to consider, which we're not going to talk too much about, would be crop rotation. And it's just going, the most basic would be if you have 4 spaces, 1 year you would have the legumes, and then you would have the roots, and then you would have the fruit, and then you would have the leaves. Whenever you do the legumes, you just cut at the base. The ones that you really need to be careful about is with the fruit. You really want to take everything out, and you want to take even any of the dead plant or any of the unpicked fruit if they're overripe and they've fallen on the ground, because you will get all those volunteers to come back the next year. A couple other notes with raised bed gardening. So, another advantage is you're going to get a less invasive. With invasive plants, one of the advantages of growing in a raised bed garden is that you can keep it within boundaries. So anybody who's grown mint and just planted it right in the ground, 5 years later, that's all you have, and it's only mint. But one of the disadvantages of this is that you have a lot of intensive maintenance in order to avoid a complete invasion. And so, one of the tricks of the trade is, even with raised bed gardening or in-ground gardening, is to plant in a pot and actually bury the pot in the ground. That still doesn't always work. So, diversification is just really important to do. And as much as you don't need to turn the soil, just making sure that there are no leftover roots or any tubers, whatever it might be that is growing, to make sure that those are all killed off. One of the ways that we really try to kill off any of the volunteer seeds that may have just been left, you think of just really trying to take out and really, if you can't get all the seeds out, doing a thick layer of compost is really also going to do the trick. So if you were to do a thick layer of compost in the fall and give the soil a rest, then by spring it should be ready to go. So cover crops are also an example of what we can do to try to give a little bit of rest to that soil and also kill off some of the additional plants that want to continue coming in. And there's a list right here of different things that we put in. Some other notes of raised bed gardening, if you have multiple garden beds, make sure that you measure out that space in between garden beds, making sure there's adequate space if you're going to be kneeling next to the garden bed, or if you have a lawnmower that's, of a particular size. You may need to do some edging and weed whacking throughout the year, because there will be, if you have grass in between, you will have those the extra grass that does not get caught by the lawnmower. So, also considering mulch or considering some kind of cover in between, whether it be, gravel. Some people are using cover crops in landscaping these days. So adding those in, or maybe even adding perennials if you're going to try to add a little creative element to just that space that's not restricted just to the box. So I mentioned pallet gardening before, composting again. This is a picture of how to extend the season. So there's actually a lot of posts that talk about using hula hoops from the dollar store and using that. I don't necessarily find that to be really sustainable for the winter months if you decide to try to keep a winter garden. But my husband actually built one and just got some just pipes from galvanized steel pipes from Home Depot, and they were the really flimsy ones where you could just bend them, and so we've just bent them into an arc and just had some supports posted in, and we actually put the posts on the inside of the garden bed, not on the outside as this picture shows, and then just use some opaque translucent screening. So final notes, just enjoy the journey of trying a raised bed garden. Some people have done themes of gardens as well. And, as I mentioned before, making one garden as a donation garden to support your local food pantry is a great theme to try. It's a great way to be able to engage in the community and make that weekly visit with your harvest. It's also a great goal to be able to have, a bag full every week out of your garden bed. And it's really possible if you follow that intensive model along with succession planting and companion planting. And then a couple other notes, that if you're trying to do more of an integrative pest management system, adding different, beneficial insects, adding in native friendly self-seeding flowers, adding monarch stations. These are all opportunities for those natural elements to come into your garden, and it just makes it a little more free-flowing. It doesn't have to be the grid model, and it by the end of the season does not always look like the grid model. And with the water supply, adding rain barrels is always encouraged. Adding a drip irrigation right next to it with a rain barrel, or even if it's coming from a direct water supply, is always going to make your life easier in terms of your garden season. These are some resources that we recommend. I love Elliot Coleman from Maine, and he has a great book, The 4-Season Harvest. And the middle one is Mel Bartholomew's book. And then companion planting, there's a great book called Carrots Love Tomatoes. Just one quick note. So the GardenWorks Project, our next meeting is next week, and it's going to be almost on the same topic. There will be a little bit of an addendum on it on how to prepare your produce for harvest, but it will be really similar. So that will be on March 10th at 6:30. And then beyond that, we have our next Food Readers Book Club meeting on April 19th. And in light of Earth Month and Earth Week, we're going to be reading The Fate of Food. So What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World by Amanda Little. And we'll actually have Jeff Garris there, who's here tonight. So and he'll be talking about some initiatives that he's going to be working on with the Forest Preserve District. And here is our contact information. What was that? Oh, I think somebody unmuted for a second, but if anybody has any questions, I'm going to stop my share right now, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that people may have.
I think that might have been me. I was unmuting in preparation for doing the Q&A.
Okay.
So if anyone has questions, please go ahead and enter them into the chat. So far, there's not a lot. There's one, I think it's Alicia had mentioned that migardener.com has $2 seed packages with free shipping, maybe with a minimum purchase. She's had good germination for most of the varieties, very budget friendly. She mentioned rareseeds.com. Baker Creek is another great option for new varieties of seeds with free shipping and a free bag of seeds with every order. And then Jeff Garris has asked, last time I tried to grow corn, the critters ate it just before harvest. Any solutions?
I would love to open this up to the group, because we grew corn this year and actually even put an electric fence, and they still found a way to eat it. And I used coyote urine. I actually taught my 5-year-old son to pee around the fence. And it did not seem to do anything. But I will say I've never used the Three Sisters method. And from what I understand, it is supposed to help in terms of keeping pests away, because the critters don't want to crawl through the spikes of the vines. And I find that with my zucchini, I don't actually keep my zucchini plant out, or I don't keep it under any kind of cover, and it never seems to be an issue.
I had good luck when I grew sweet corn. Can you hear me?
We can.
Can you hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay, I had good luck growing sweet corn when I put a light out in the garden and played it, ran it all night, then played WBBM radio and put it on loud. And then the other thing I did was put real stinky women's perfume on the silks, and the raccoons did not mess with it. So I don't know. Now, as far as other plants, I'm trying to think of the name of that company in Texas that sells organic products. They have some stuff in there that actually Muskoff developed that you sprinkle on your plants, and mice, raccoons, or whatever, you know, it's made for different animals. They won't eat it. And so I trying to remember can't remember the name of that darn company out of Texas. I'm sorry, my brain just won't think of it. I could look it up.
I've had really good luck with keeping critters out of my yard and out from underneath my shed by using used kitty litter. So that might be something you might want to try. Yeah, it sounds gross, but man, it worked. So
you take the kitty litter and sprinkle it on?
Well, I didn't use it in a garden, but I used it because skunks were coming in my yard and they were going underneath my shed. So I just did the perimeter and it helped. Oh. So I guess maybe like in a raised garden, you would put it around the box, like around the raised garden. I think that might help. I'm telling you, it was amazing. I mean, my problem instantly went away. It was great. I loved it.
The company, I found their book, it's called Spray and then capital N Grow. Spray and Grow.
Spray and Grow.
And they sell all kinds of products for different animals. And like I said, it worked. One year I had mice overrun my 50-foot by 100-foot garden. And their product kept them from eating it. And like I said, they have them for all different kinds of animals. You sprinkle this on. It really works.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I love these tips.
Okay, hopefully I won't have a lot of bad feedback, but next question is, what did you put under your new raised beds?
Amazingly, if you use 20 cubic feet and have it at least 6 inches deep with soil, you can put it right on top of grass and the grass will not grow through.
All right, and then doing a raised bed for the first time, this is Stacy. What should I fill it with? Any suggestions? You mentioned Kellogg's. Do I put something to block weeds or not so that the roof?
Yeah. So I just mentioned that I usually don't put anything down. If you really feel like you have some really, I don't know, if you have weeds underneath and you're really worried about the weeds coming up, you can find some uncolored cardboard boxes, like Amazon boxes would be fine. Even paper bags, like Trader Joe's bags would be fine. Just laying them on the ground before you put the soil. I would say, you know, with raised bed gardens, it's really recommended that you use raised bed garden soil because you do want a softer type soil, something that you can is really workable. And standard standard topsoil or garden soil is going to be a lot heavier. So in order to make it a little more budget friendly, because Kellogg's is admittedly very expensive. It's about $9 to $10 per bag, and you need a total of 10 bags. So one way to do that is to get a garden soil and to do what Mel has recommended by adding some kind of amendment to soften it up. And so I have heard of people who use garden soil in a combination of perlite and peat moss. That would be one option. You know, my gardener that was just recommended by, I think, Alicia, is a great resource on YouTube. And I think that they actually have one on raised bed garden soil. So that would be something that I would consider. But Kellogg is a great one. Anything now, raised bed gardening is pretty popular. So if you were to go to a store, they usually have that differentiation.
Sorry, it wasn't unmuting first. The next question is, the last 2 years I tried to grow Brussels sprouts. I planted them in the spring, but by the end of the fall, they just started to produce sprouts, but never big enough to eat. When should I plant them in our region, or is there a particular variety that grows better here?
Yeah, no, I would actually just look at the variety date, because I know that that there are Brussels sprouts that will take over 100 days, and there are some varieties that are just under that. They do take all season, I will say that. A lot of plants like that, I would actually recommend starting this spring at your inside, getting a fairly good start with them and then growing them throughout the season. The one saving grace with Brussels sprouts, which is something that I rarely can grow successfully, and we don't ever encourage our first-time families to grow Brussels sprouts because they're not easy, is to use the leaves. So if you don't get the actual squash, you can use the leaves, and the leaves taste like your standard collard green. And they're not, surprisingly, not as bitter as the actual sprout.
That is interesting. I'd never thought about that. And actually, Alicia said Brussels sprouts grow well. They just need to be trimmed on the top a month or a month and a half before frost time. So there's, thank you for that. Next question is from Margie P. How do we prevent squash and cucumbers from cross-pollinating?
Yeah, that is a tricky one. I mean, I think it does depend on the variety. With a hybrid variety, you're not going to get that cross-pollination, but with a lot of our you know, I actually don't know the science behind each of those. So it would be one that does not cross-pollinate. I would just go the safe route. Something like a market more is not going to cross-pollinate with a squash because of the variety that they are. One, you know, I don't know how much garden space you do have, you know, but it could be a timing thing where if you are trying to grow, let's say, a yellow squash, which I do find very funny shaped things that look like yellow squash on other plants throughout the year. You know, it might just be something where yellow squash actually has a really short harvest date. Consider growing them at a different time. Start your cucumbers on May 15th. They'll be done by August, and then you can try the squash in August 15th, and I can almost guarantee you'll have a pretty good harvest before October.
All right. Next question is from Jan Smith. What was that tip from the dollar store you mentioned? Something instead of peat moss?
Oh, I don't think it was the dollar store, but it was just a tip to create raised bed garden soil. It would be instead of using the coconut amendment and using the greener mix option that was mentioned before, but instead it would be to get garden soil and mix it with peat moss and perlite. That would soften the soil. I think that was what I had mentioned before.
All right, Jan, if that didn't answer your question, go ahead and put something else in the chat. Then Bill Pickens has a question. We have an unground garden that does well. Do you recommend also having raised beds and which plants go in which garden?
Okay, in-ground garden, right? Yeah, you know, I actually don't have, I don't necessarily know if there would be a preference. I know that there are a lot of people that are hesitant to put a carrot in a raised bed garden because they think that it's not long enough. If you have at least 8 inches of soil and you're working with a variety that has a typical length of 8 inches, you will get 7-inch carrots. And I grow my carrots in there all the time. I grow all my root vegetables in raised bed gardens. I actually find it a lot easier because those seeds are really tricky to germinate and to sprout if there isn't the perfect environment for them. And then they also will have the perfect kind of soil to root down. So you end up getting straight plants as well, or straight root vegetables. So I love doing carrots. I actually really enjoy doing lettuce and doing like mixed greens. So any kind of small seed that really needs softer soil to sprout and to really root down is probably going to be your best bet for raised bed gardens. I still do all of my tomatoes actually in-ground. I find it to be easier for them to establish a solid root system. I have unfortunately seen tomato plants in raised bed gardens from our clients that, you know, on a windy day completely fall over, whereas, and the roots coming up as well because it is softer. Yes, hula hoops from the dollar store. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. Now I know what she was talking about. So yeah, anything with really substantial roots and anything that's going to be really hardy throughout the season, I would probably put in ground. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, and the next, any tips on how to get rid of cucumber beetles?
Oh, I would love to open this up to the group. I've heard using diatomaceous, what is this called? Diatomaceous earth is one. It's having that abrasion that keeps the beetles away, but I do get beetles every year. I get beetles and I get cabbage worms every year, and it is just a constant battle. I did I did do a, and I know a lot of people find this to be tricky, but praying mantis, I did an egg sac of praying mantis, and I know that they do kill and eat beneficial insects. I've had one even bite me and it actually hurt. So they are tough insects, but I had substantially less insects that year and less invasive. So if you're willing to do that and willing to take that risk, it is one good option. And I wouldn't be surprised if they would also eat all the cabbage beetles, or sorry, cucumber beetles. But if anybody else has any suggestions, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I used diatomaceous earth, you know, like a spray mixed up with some dishwasher soap and water,
Okay.
you know, spray and add of neem oil, like teeny bit for to you know, scare them away or get rid of them, because diatomaceous earth actually cuts the insects' legs or whatever and makes them dry out and die. But it's not totally successful. And I tried to use the yellow sticky pads because they tend to go on yellow. They're in the squash flowers and those cucumber flowers, but nothing really gets them 100%, and they killed all cucumber plants.
Yeah.
At the end, because they spread that virus, and the cucumber plants just wilt and die. So I was just curious if somebody had success with anything else.
I will say I have had success with at least keeping them at bay. It doesn't kill them, but the neem oil does keep them away for a bit. But you do have to be pretty meticulous. Yeah, you have to do it all the time throughout the season in order for it to work.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is Jessica saying she's very new to gardening. Should we start germinating any seeds indoors this early, or is that unnecessary?
Yeah, that's so that's a tricky one. You know, I think that it depends on I would say, you know, now is a good time to get started. For some plants, if you're really wanting to get them started. So if you want to start sweet potatoes, now would be the time. This is a great time to get them started. But things like tomatoes and peppers, I would wait. I personally would wait a couple weeks, just given that I have a tendency of getting them to be too leggy. They really just want that outdoor air. They need that hardening off, and that becomes a little meticulous. Winter sowing, which I think Cheryl mentions right after, is a great way to do it. Just YouTube winter sowing, and you will find 1,000 videos on it. And I don't think any of them would be incorrect, because it's really the laziest way to start seeds. It's essentially creating a greenhouse with a milk jug or some kind of container with a little bit of access for water, and you just leave it outside, even through the frost and through the cold, even through the snow, and it'll come up when the soil is at the right temperature. And because it's insulated, because it's protected with this moisture barrier, it will grow on its own, and there really isn't that much you need to do. I think the only tricky thing with winter sowing is sometimes the seeds get jostled around, and then you just have a little tricky time to try to pull them all apart without damaging the seeds. So to answer Cheryl's question, you know, I think people do everything. I mean, I've been shocked to see people doing lettuce, which I would never even think you really even need to do lettuce, because you just plant it right in the ground, it just comes right up. But people do lettuce, people do root vegetables. But if you really want to get something that's going to be the best bang for your buck, and maybe you only have 4 milk jugs, I would do tomatoes, I would do peppers, you know, any of those warm season varieties that you really would normally have to meticulously monitor and seed start and harden off and continue watering and manage throughout the spring months, that sometimes gets a little tedious by May, those are probably going to be your best options. Yeah, if anybody else has suggestions, I'd love to hear it.
You know, lettuce can be planted even on the snow. I've done it. It had a couple inches of snow and put it on top, because when it's ready, it'll germinate and come up. And, you know,
I just read that about clover too, that a lot of farmers are just placing them right on top of the snow, and it just melts into the ground as the snow melts. What a great!
Yeah, it's a lot easier. When I did it as a kid, walking through the mud, my hand, you know, twirling your little thing, it was tiring.
Oh my gosh, that's so fun. I think I'm going to try that this year with lettuce.
Okay. Urban had also said, I start parsley, herbs, and tomatoes now, but you must transplant tomatoes many times so they don't get spindly.
Yeah.
Some other things with the starting stuff now. Jan has a follow-up comment and question. Peat moss is not sustainable. Is coconut coir a good substitute? And Urban did say the coconut, is it coconut coil or coconut coir? Great.
What was that?
I think he spelled it correctly. But anyway, I said it was great.
Is it coconut coir or coconut coil?
It comes in a small block, and you hydrate it and it gets
Huge.
expands.
Yeah.
And it is sustainable because it's kind of a waste product. But the more recent years, they're saying it takes so many years for peat moss to form
To grow.
that it's being
Yeah.
mined faster than it's being created.
Wow.
So better not to use it for that reason. Although I love it, and I have used it before I knew that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Then Nancy Olson said, I did tomatoes last year for the first time in a raised bed garden and got the best crop ever. No black spot. They were beautiful.
It's great.
So any other questions? So if there are any,
Gardens Alive calls those, they call it grow bricks. They, you know, expand. I used it for strawberry starting last year. I killed my bed and started over. And it was the most effective thing I've ever seen to make. Probably got 1,000 strawberry plants came out of starting 50 of them. So that coconut was just super, keeping it moist and weeds out.
Yeah, I was just wondering about strawberries. I had something in the chat. I think I accidentally sent it to Gail, but I was wondering what your secret is for growing strawberries. We don't have the right soil in one bed, and they just don't come. They just don't grow. You have the plant, the green part, but the red part just doesn't grow, you know, past the size of a pea.
Do you know what kind of variety you have? Is it maybe the variety?
I don't know.
That's probably the variety, because strawberries will grow in any kind of soil, real crummy soil to real good soil.
Okay. I could just rip them out and find some better strawberry plants.
Yeah, look in the University of Illinois Extension Service recommends about 10 different varieties for up here, and so any of those are fine. I even grow the Gurney, great big one. It's called Whopper strawberry.
Whopper?
Yeah.
Well, and I will say the native strawberry plant will often not actually produce fruit. And when it does, it's the form of a wild strawberry. And it's, I mean, it is the size of a pea. It's very small.
Yeah, we have those growing in the yard in different places. So hopefully it's not the same thing. But no, these are like really huge plants. Just all green, all leafy stuff. I just figured they weren't happy. It was in a raised bed too, so maybe it's, but the soil was maybe a little bit too heavy and wasn't really worked up right.
You were
Jeannie?
right. You were right or correct in your answer about hybrids, like the cucumber you recommended and the other plants. I grow them all tight together, cucumbers and all the squashes and things. And as long as they're a hybrid, they tend not to crossbreed. The open pollinated, the old open pollinated, those are the ones you have trouble with.
Yeah.
Cynthia's hand's been raised. Cynthia, do you have a question?
Unmute. Yeah, I love green beans, and I've tried the bush beans, but nothing has kept the rabbits away from decimating them. Do you have any suggestions? Usually what I've done the last few years is switch to tall towers, and then I can put chicken netting around the bottom without having to put a net barrier around everything.
Yeah. So but you prefer bush beans over pole beans? Is that what you're saying?
No, but the square foot gardening said, you can put so many bean plants. I just love beans, the pole beans, the bush beans, I'm okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, depending on when you are in the season, they come up so quickly that, you can net, which would be an option.
That's true.
What was that?
That's true. Give them, do the netting and then give them a chance. And then once they're older, the rabbits don't bother them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll do that. I'll try that.
And I did want to share kind of a conversation that's happened in chat. And then you can fill in. People are answering like other people's questions. I love it. So Stacy had asked, how do you treat powdery mildew, anything other than neem oils? Last year I got hit hard. And then Alicia and Cheryl kind of offered suggestions. So Me Gardener Luke says, mix water, dish soap, and baking soda with a drop of dish soap. So to stick to the leaves, it's a lower pH and controls the powdery mildew. She had some luck with that. And then Cheryl also offered 4 cups of water plus a half a tablespoon of vinegar. Spray the top and bottom of the leaves once a week.
Yeah, I use dish soap and water, not even the baking soda. I wonder if the baking soda would add to it, but yeah, and it has to be like your standard, what is the Palmolive or whatever the brand would be, but nothing really fancy. Dish soap and water. And I've used that and it does seem to help. I think the other issue with powdery mildew is it spreads. So if you see it and let's say it's a zucchini, you cut that right at the stem and trim away and allow the new leaves to form. Anyone else?
Any other questions or advice you want to share?
Jeff and Bonnie have their hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Jump in.
Oh, hi. I was wondering about planting herbs. You mentioned, I think, basil with planting with something, but do you plant many herbs in the raised bed gardens?
Oh, we do. Yeah. For our home gardeners, we actually do basil, chive, parsley, cilantro, and I believe thyme.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And thyme is an optional one, just because it will, come back, and not everyone wants thyme every single year. But, yeah. And what, I am a bit of a lazy gardener, and so I do not follow the grid pattern as well as I should, and I teach it, and I will preach the journal and the note taking, and yet I will not live up to that standard because I always fall flat. But But that being said, there are so many resources that show, and I after this, I can actually send it to one of you all, maybe the contact person, she can send it out. But there's a resource page that we actually give to our people who ask about it, and it's not even ours, but it's a companion planting one, and it does pair a lot of things that should be grown together.
Oh,
And herbs are actually really common because most herbs don't take too much space, nor do they take up too much of the nutrients, and so they do pair well. But some of them are actually good because they're pest deterrents, when you think about chive or parsley or cilantro. So
oh, okay.
Yeah, if you could share that with Wendy, and then she could forward it to the rest of
Okay.
the club.
yeah.
And so far, I don't have any other questions. So if something's occurring to you, please put it in the chat. But we said thank you so much, Jeannie. Nice job. Great tips. Thank you. And then Margie P said, and sage, it improves pollination. So thank you. This was great. So yeah, it sounds like that is the end of the questions.